good. But we'll let Jim speak now. And if you guys got any questions, we're going to talk some later if you got any questions. Here we go, Jim Ostrowski, Liberty Movement. One of the few attorneys that will step up to the plate and go against the system.
Can you turn the lights on so the people can see how handsome I am? You're gonna get that laptop.
That's $5.
I gotta clear all this stuff out of here. Oh, thank you. That's excellent. Fasten your seatbelts, it's gonna be a bumpy ride. Show of hands, any undercover FBI agents here? Oh, there, it's always the guy with the beard. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm gonna get right into it. I got a lot of ground to cover, so I'm gonna talk fast like a used car salesman. Country is in serious trouble. The last 2 years, we saw the government grab near totalitarian power by executive decree like the Caesars of ancient times. The economy is in a shambles. The schools are filled with crazy left-wing propaganda. Crime is exploding while the government seeks to disarm us and leave us defenseless against criminals and criminal governments. The left-wing Democrats who run this state from their hideaways in the Upper West Side of Manhattan and the Upper East Side of Manhattan have thumbed their noses at the Supreme Court by essentially overturning the pro-Second Amendment decision in the Brune case by passing the most obviously illegal gun laws ever enacted in the United States. Aside from a few lawsuits that will take years to wind their way through the courts, there was no great public uprising. Do you really believe that the very same judges who the politicians put on the bench and who are brainwashed into a left progressive big government mindset in law school are going to come to the rescue? They failed miserably to save us from the lockdown. I filed a major challenge to the lockdown on May 15th, 2020, and the judge assigned the case sat on it for a year until all the executive orders we complained about had been repealed, and then declared the case was moot. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. What did the dispensers of conventional wisdom tell us to do in response to the destruction of the greatest country that has ever existed? Vote harder. Vote for uninspiring and bland Republicans who promise nothing specific so that when they win, they will owe nothing to anyone but their wealthy donors. Have you read the platforms of Lee Zeldin, Mitch McConnell, and Kevin McCarthy? Don't bother. I read them so you don't have to. The GOP stands for nothing, and although they will win the House again, like they did in 1994 and 2010, they will waste the opportunity once again because they believe in nothing. After they won in 2010, I publicly challenged them to do just one thing right: get rid of the Housing and Urban Development Corporation, a useless, corrupt, destructive, and unconstitutional federal agency that wastes $60 billion a year. There's nothing federal about housing. It's as local as you can get. It's totally unconstitutional. What did the GOP do? Nothing but keep HUD and keep flushing over $60 billion a year down the toilet. We are here today to say that stronger medicine is needed. We need to take matters into our own hands because we have seen the handiwork of politicians, judges, the media, big tech, big pharma, big medicine. We need to realize and recognize that electoral politics is a rigged game and that we need to choose different battlefields from those where we must attack the adversary at his strongest, most reinforced position, like Lee tried at Pickett's charge in Gettysburg. Instead, we propose today to turn the tables on our adversaries and move the battle to more favorable ground where we can catch our opponents by surprise and where we have the tactical advantage. In my 5 books on the subject, I recommend a wide array of direct citizen action to advance liberty. But today we want to talk about one of the oldest mechanisms, as Dave talked about, to check the power of the state and tyrants, the grand jury. In Old England, the grand jury was designed to check the power of the king and later Parliament, and played a role in England becoming one of the freest nations on earth and the birthplace of the Liberty Movement in 1650. The British levelers and Whigs were the unheralded pre-founding fathers who heavily influenced the American founders. The framers locked in the right to a grand jury in the Fifth Amendment, and in many states, including New York, ensconced it in their own constitutions. Murray Rothbard wisely observed that almost every device designed to advance liberty was eventually perverted to shrink it, and so with grand juries. Legislators, judges, and prosecutors combined to eventually reduce its role, its authority, its autonomy, and its power to advance liberty. Today's grand juries are such a rubber stamp for abusive prosecutors that even the chief judge of the state of New York said, quote, "A grand jury would indict a ham sandwich if that's what you wanted." One study concluded that grand juries indict 99% of the time. Why did the grand jury decline as an essential means of protecting us against government tyranny? First of all, the ideology of the American people drastically changed from small government libertarianism to big government progressivism. Second, progressive legislators, judges, and prosecutors changed the rules and practices of the grand jury. For example, they make it a crime for people to contact the grand jury and ask them to investigate crimes, and they require the prosecutors to sign off on all indictments. Third, the grand jury was supposed to be the institution that protected the people from government. However, these days, 15% of the people on the grand jury work for the government. Since Whose Bread I Eat, His Song I Must Sing, we can predict that the 3 or 4 grand jurors out of 23 who work for the government will tend to favor the prosecutor's point of view. Since there are about 1 million police officers in the country, the typical grand jury may also contain at least one police officer who can be counted on to favor the prosecution. Fourth, the entire experience of a grand juror, from the time they enter the courthouse to the time they complete their assignment, is coercive in nature and not designed to inculcate an attitude that the grand juror is an independent and powerful constitutional officer. In an ideal world, jury service would be voluntary, like so many of the things we do to create a better community. However, in this world, it is compulsory, which sadly sends completely the wrong message to grand juries, that they are under the control of the court, prosecutors, and police, when in fact, as it pertains to their actual function, they are not under their control at all. Second, when they arrive at the courthouse, like all other courtroom visitors, they are treated like criminals and subjected to a humiliating search without probable cause. Americans are used to these searches now, like the boiled frog we've all heard about many times, and now barely give it a second thought when our women are ordered to empty your purses and our men are told to take their belts off. Again, this experience, even subliminally, sends a clear message. You are under the control of the police, the judges, and the prosecutors. Notice that they all exempt themselves from these searches. Only citizens are not to be trusted. Finally, when you get to the courtroom or jury room, you're given an endless series of orders as to what you may not do or what you may do. Please, sir, may I use the bathroom? You are kept in seclusion and secrecy and have no choice in the matter. State and federal law tries to make any contact with a grand jury a crime. Finally, the judge and prosecutors give you legal instructions, some of which are correct and some of which may not be correct. These instructions contain many warnings and prohibitions. Again, some of these may be valid points, but they add to the cumulative atmosphere of coercion, which seems to belie what Judge Scalia said, that the grand jury is an independent institution, not under the control of the government. The combined effect of all these dynamics sends a clear message. You are an inferior player in the system. You are inferior to all the other actors in the legal system, the court officers, the prosecutors, the judges, and even their staffs. This message does not inculcate an attitude of fearless independence. A grand jury needs to fulfill their original purpose as bulwarks against officials who abuse their power, including the police, the prosecutors, and the judges, the very people who control the grand jurors from the moment they enter the courthouse to the moment they leave it. We have no magic solution to this conundrum other than exactly what we are doing here tonight, explaining to citizens that if you are called to serve on a grand jury, remember these things. The judge is not your boss. The judge is not your boss. The prosecutor is not your boss. You don't have to indict anyone you don't want to indict. You have the right to investigate public corruption, as Dave said, and misconduct. Issue indictments, whether the prosecutor wants or the judge wants you to do so or not. Can the grand jury be salvaged? We think so, and that's why we're here today. In any event, we have to exhaust every peaceful and legal means of redress to save our country from those who hate it and want to destroy it. Over the decades, the legal establishment has tried to limit or reduce the powers of grand juries by formal and informal methods of control. However, since the grand jury is a constitutional institution that predates even the founding of the United States, they were not able to abolish it entirely or eliminate all of its historical prerogatives. That's their Achilles heel. What we propose is simply this: educate the public as to their existing and clearly established legal rights as grand jurors, pursuant to constitutional law, the common law, statutory law, and court rules. The legal establishment does not really want you to know anything I'm about to tell you. They want you to be good little sheep doing what the prosecutor and judges tell you to do. What I am here to tell you is this: the grand jury is not the adult replay of the government school classroom with the kids in the back and the teacher up front barking orders at you, backed up by the principal down the hall if you show any signs of gumption. As grand jurors, the prosecutor is not your teacher, and the judge is not your principal. When it comes to the substance of your work, deciding whom to indict or not indict, whom to investigate or not investigate, and your deliberations and voting, you have no boss, as Dave said, other than your own good judgment. Is that my opinion? No. Let me quote from Judge Scalia, as Dave mentioned. Rooted in long centuries of Anglo-American history, the grand jury is mentioned in the Bill of Rights, but not in the body of the Constitution. It has not been textually assigned, therefore, to any of the branches described in the first three articles. It is a constitutional fixture in its own right. In fact, the whole theory of its function is that it belongs to no branch of the institutional government, serving as a kind of buffer or referee between the government and the people. Although the grand jury normally operates, of course, in the courthouse and under judicial auspices, its institutional relationship with the judicial branch has traditionally been, so to speak, at arm's length. Judges' direct involvement in the function of the grand jury has generally been confined to the constitutive one of calling the grand jurors together and administering their oaths of office. The grand jury's functional independence from the judicial branch is evident both in the scope of its power to investigate criminal wrongdoing and in the manner in which that power is exercised. Unlike a court whose jurisdiction is predicated on a specific case or controversy, the grand jury can investigate merely on suspicion that the law is being violated, or even because it wants assurance that it is not. It need not identify the offender or suspects, or even the precise nature of the offense it is investigating. The grand jury requires no authorization from its constituting court to initiate an investigation, and in its day-to-day functioning, the grand jury generally operates without interference from the presiding judge. It swears in its own witnesses and deliberates in total secrecy. The grand jury remains free to pursue its investigations unhindered by external influence or supervision, so long as it does not trench upon the legitimate rights of any witness called before. Recognizing this tradition of independence, we have said that the Fifth Amendment's constitutional guarantee presupposes an investigative body acting independently of either prosecuting attorney or judge, close quote. That's not me, that's the member of the Supreme Court. So the grand jury is independent of the government, and intentionally so, and grand jurors have the constitutional authority and freedom to make decisions without interference from prosecutors and judges, even if judges can later make rulings about some of their actions. But even that judicial power cannot override your decision not to indict, which is probably the main power of grand jurors and the one they all too rarely exercise in these perilous times of creeping totalitarian government and blatantly politicized law enforcement. So let's talk about what you need to know about being a grand jury. And this is all in the law of the state of New York. I'm not making this up. The right to a grand jury is guaranteed in the New York State Constitution in Article 1, Section 6. And it states that the power of grand juries to inquire into the willful misconduct in office of public officials and to find indictments or to direct the finding of information in connection with such inquiries shall never be suspended or impaired by law. Did anybody know any of this, that you have the power to investigate public corruption? So basically, the Constitution gives the grand jury the sole power to indict for a felony, a crime with a sentence longer than 1 year. Additionally, the Constitution gives the grand jury the power to investigate willful misconduct by public officials and to indict them as well for felonies. And how many hundreds have they committed in the last 2 years? These are awesome powers, and the legal establishment is terrified of the public finding out about them and using them to advance liberty. There's additional powers as well. All deliberations and votes are done in secret with no prosecutors present. That means that the grand jury is autonomous. Also, grand jurors are not allowed to disclose their deliberations or votes, and no outside authority can punish you for your choices. The law states that the grand jury is the exclusive judge of the facts of any case before it. Again, that means no outside authority can ever dispute any factual conclusions you reach as a grand juror. As grand jurors, you may call witnesses, and the district attorney must issue a subpoena for any such witnesses. Grand jurors may hear and examine evidence concerning any alleged crime that can be prosecuted in the county where you sit, and also about any misconduct, again, nonfeasance or neglect in public office by a public servant, whether criminal or otherwise. The grand jury may submit reports about public corruption as well, and that's an incredibly broad list of powers that is hardly ever used. Finally, and here's the startling news that could change the course of Hochul's war on the right to bear arms. Grand juries do not have to indict people charged with imaginary gun crimes, even if probable cause exists to indict them. So those are basically the extensive powers that you have on a grand jury that, although if you read the jury instructions close enough, you might be in there somewhere, but most people don't know this, and most people don't learn it on the grand jury. So that's why we're here today. Federal grand jury is fairly similar. You have the same basic powers. So let me suggest that grand juries have 2 additional powers that the current law may not recognize, but which are consistent with the nature of the grand jury as described by Judge Scalia. Grand juries must be able to do their own research, particularly when it comes to public corruption, and not just get all their information from the U.S. Attorney or DA. And grand juries must be able to ask and invite the public to send them their criminal complaints. Right now, if you want the grand jury to investigate something and you go to the courthouse and ask where the grand jury is, they'll probably arrest you. That's nuts, that's crazy. There has to be a way, and we're trying to figure that out. But one way is if you're on a grand jury, communicate to the judge that you want it known that you will accept public complaints of corruption that are not being dealt with by the existing prosecutors. So with this long list of powers, patriots can begin to counterattack against the war on the Second Amendment and begin to investigate the many crimes of the lockdown. The crimes of the lockdown, there's thousands of them. Patriots serving on grand juries do not have to indict for imaginary crimes that make it illegal for otherwise peaceful and law-abiding citizens to exercise their right to keep and bear arms. Such imaginary crimes include having a gun without getting the permission of a judge or a cop. I represent people getting licensed. I refuse to ask for one. I'm sorry, I'm not gonna ask a judge for permission to have a gun. Having a rifle that folks on the Upper West Side of Manhattan think is scary looking, and having too much ammunition lying around. You don't have to wait for decades for some judge to declare these laws unconstitutional. You can declare them unconstitutional in the jury room by voting not to indict. That is how you can use the grand jury as a shield against tyranny. But we can also use grand juries as a sword to investigate the many crimes of the lockdown. In my webinar with Naomi Wolf on using the criminal law to investigate the crimes of the lockdown, we listed many potential crimes that may have been committed, and these include threatening medical professionals with disciplinary action for making or even discussing reasonable treatment decisions. That's a crime. That needs to be investigated, and those people need to be indicted. I don't care if it's the governor or the commissioner of the Department of Health. I just don't care. Stay-at-home orders, closing businesses, schools, and houses of worship in violation of federal and international law, applying treatments likely to cause death or serious injury, inappropriate use of remdesivir, for example. And I spent 2 months litigating these things with Ralph Larigo. ventilators and vaccines, which constitute criminally negligent homicide, deliberately withholding treatments likely to reduce the risk of death and illness, again, criminally negligent homicide, mask mandates endangering the welfare of a child. I sued Hochul over that, it's still in court. Vaccine mandates endangering the welfare of a child, conspiracy against rights, and crimes against humanity. Falsely reporting COVID statistics, including deaths, falsifying business records, filing a false instrument, false statements about the safety and efficacy of vaccines and/or remdesivir, which is falsifying business records, healthcare fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to defraud the government, etc., etc. False statements about PCR tests, false statements under oath about COVID or the lockdown, false unsworn statements about COVID or the lockdown made to federal agencies. That's a crime, 18 U.S.C. 1001. False information about prevention and early treatment, suppression of free of speech on social media by government officials, vaccinating children and endangering the welfare of a child, false entries in medical or business records. Boy, are there a lot of false entries in medical or business records in the last 2 years. Reinvigorated grand juries can and should investigate these potential crimes, some of which are state and some of which are federal. It's obvious that if we wait for the police or prosecutors to do their job, it will never happen. So, in conclusion, and it's not a short conclusion, so just a couple minutes. Let me close by asking this. If we don't start to use bold new direct action strategies, such as reviving the role of grand juries in advancing liberty, let's consider the alternatives. One possible option is we lose. The country continues its inevitable drift towards left progressive globalist totalitarianism, of which we got a nice preview during the lockdown. But let's be honest, government has been growing and liberty's been shrinking for over 100 years. All that is happening in recent years is government growth is accelerating rapidly. Why? Long story very short, because modern politics is not based on reason, logic, or fact, Dave. It's based on the politics of psychotherapy. Politics of psychotherapy. The use of the state to make people feel better about living in a world that is fraught with peril, uncertainty, and endless change, and where seemingly unlimited human wants and desires and dreams are crushed by the reality that all resources are scarce. The ideology of progressivism is simply the promise to use the state to solve all the problems of life, primarily the problems of fear, envy, and scarce resources. In recent years, leftism has reemerged from the obscurity it richly deserved after creating many hells on earth everywhere it was tried, starting with the French Revolution and continuing with the Bolshevik and Maoist experiments in mass murder during the 20th century. Like progressivism, leftism is best seen as a politics of psychotherapy. The poor leftist is driven by a fanatical desire to use the state to make everyone equal in every way. However, since talents, brains, creativity, diligence, and courage are unevenly distributed among the population, we will never have material equality, folks. The rhetoric of equality, however, merely masks the true motivation of the leftist, the hatred of those he or she perceives as his betters. The leftist is generally an unhappy person. You see them on TV, you know what I'm talking about, who, instead of stoically making the best of his or her abilities in this world, blames his unhappiness on his betters and seeks to use the state not to raise people up and improve life, but to punish his enemies and therefore assuage his envy and hatred for his enemies. Here's the problem. Our modern politics of psychotherapy has no limiting principle. So long as there is fear, unmet wants, uncertainty about the future, and a material inequality, the government will need to grow and grow and grow until it controls absolutely everything, and we got a preview in the last 2 years. So option one is we live in a futuristic totalitarian state where the government uses the latest technology to monitor and control everything we do all day long and even while we sleep. Is the grand jury option sounding a little better? Option two. We do what we're told to do in high school civics class. Be good little solid citizens and go vote. Libertarians have a standard joke about this that we use every time our allies try once again to use electoral politics to advance liberty, and Dwayne, that joke is?
Vote harder.
Vote harder. This is another topic that would require a separate seminar, but long story short, politics is rigged, and the last election that significantly advanced the liberty of a large portion of the American citizenry was 1800. Think about it though. Government grabs your kids at age 5 and subjects them to 13 years of endless political propaganda. The government has made half of its citizens financially dependent on itself, including the 15% who work for the government. The government controls the election process itself and uses that control to make it more difficult to use elections to change anything. The government, through its control of the police, prosecutors, and courts, systematically discriminates against and retaliates against dissidents, protesters, and the leader of any movement that might actually change things, as a clear signal and object lesson to anyone tempted to do likewise. Look at Trump. Like him or not, agree with him or not, but he did challenge the establishment, and they have made his life a living hell as his reward for doing so. The government uses its control over big tech to censor those who challenge the power elite. Finally, the power elite monetizes its control of the government in its $10 trillion annual budget and extensive regulatory control of the economy to make sure that any challenger who proposes real change is outspent 50-1 in the election. And in spite of all these obvious facts that prove that politics is rigged, you think that voting harder is the answer? How about option 3, violence? Violence. Let's be super clear about this. And this is for the undercover and FBI agents who show up when I talk. Because as this movement grows and goes national, and I guarantee you it will grow and it will go national, our enemies will lie about us and portray us as dangerous insurrectionists. But everything that libertymovement.org recommends is legal and peaceful. If you go to the website or look at our literature, you will see that our logo is the dove with an olive branch, an ancient symbol of peace. Political violence is wrong, does not work, is counterproductive, and will be used as an excuse to grab ever more power to oppress and repress us, which is why these degenerates love to go out and find mentally unstable people, whisper in their ears, and encourage them to plan acts of political violence. Don't make their day. Stay peaceful at all times. Never fire the first shot. Never fire the first shot. Worse yet, there is no guarantee that a violent uprising would result in greater liberty, even if the current odious regime is replaced. While it is true that the American Revolution did increase the liberty of most Americans for a period of time, most revolutions, growing out of violent civil war and chaos, leading to conditions where, to paraphrase F.A. Hayek, the worst get to the top, results in the installation of authoritarian or even genocidal regimes. Meet the new boss, worse than the old boss. Peaceful means of change, on the other hand, that require, as we're doing here tonight, the changing of hearts, minds, beliefs, and values are the only means of achieving permanent increases in liberty. Reviving grand juries is one important means of peaceful and legal change that libertymovement.org will be rolling out in the coming months. And thank you very much.